Greetings, friends of liberty. I must count myself very satisfied that when I look at the city with new buildings sprouting up everywhere, rising like a flock of startled starlings, we see London growing by such leaps and bounds that it boggles the mind to imagine what it might look like a century hence. So, for example, the population of London in 1500 was about 100,000. In 1600, about 300,000. In 1700, about 500,000. Now, in 1793, 'tis about 1 million. What shall it be in the year 1900? 3 million? 5 million? Utterly astonishing. Imagine then how even greater our productivity shall be. Now, one reason that we've made such progress, both the population and the number of buildings skyrocketing, is that the building codes of the city are now relatively permissive, reminding us yet again of the necessity of freedom, here specifically with regard to urban planning and land use regulation. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, the building codes were changed to merely stipulate a few requirements. A, that tiles on roofs and bricks for walls should be used to prevent yet another conflagration. B, that the width of streets be proportional to the height of houses. And C, that the type of frontal facades available that a house builder might choose, unfortunately, was stipulated and relatively limited. Other than these requirements, developers were free to build pretty much as they liked. And outside the city, as in Westminster and throughout the rest of the realm, householders and builders had even more freedom, all of which has redounded to our benefit now for the subsequent 130-odd years. However, I must unfortunately point out that this freedom did not always exist. Quite to the contrary. Before the Great Fire, from about 1580 onwards, the parliaments, the monarchs of the realm, such as Elizabeth and James I and many city aldermen and mayors, constantly felt it their duty to forbid the construction of new, perfectly harmless buildings, usually from 1 to 5 miles from the city gates. So, for example, Cromwell ordered that if you were to build within 9 miles of London, your building plot must be at least 4 acres large, that being just one of the many absurdities of the Protectorate. Whatever was their rationale for this stubborn and unjust oppressiveness, they all claimed, through various royal proclamations, acts of parliament and Star Chamber orders, that there were either too many migrants coming into the city, that the buildings were not of a sufficient quality, that the health of the citizenry was impaired somehow, or that some builders made too much money. And what was the consequence of their many rules? Even cheaper buildings being built, so that if they were discovered and torn down, the builder wouldn't suffer much of a loss. Additionally, also even more overcrowding, and finally, the price of accommodations rising as a result of this undersupply of housing. Thank God, however, as destructive as the Great Fire was, it motivated a whole new, freer approach to building. Now, if we turn to the issue of housing and land use regulations in your own 20th and 21st century in London and much of the British Isles today, we find IEA economist Kristian Niemietz in the spotlight, like last week, here offering his own solutions to a much greater housing crisis than ever occurred in Elizabethan England. In Home Win, What If Britain Solved Its Housing Crisis?, Niemietz outlines the great benefits that would occur in Britain if it could only finally resolve the multiple issues of providing more housing stock to a nation starved of homes and apartments for many decades. In effect, he acts like a housing Doctor Who traveling to the future to see what it would look like if certain restrictions on home building were lifted. Niemietz begins by outlining the unique and dire situation familiar to and faced by so many Britons. Number one, catching up with the EU average in terms of the number of housing units per 100,000 inhabitants would require the construction of 3.4 million additional homes in England alone. Matching the housing stock of German-speaking Europe would require the construction of closer to 5 million, and matching the housing stock of France, close to 9 million homes. And this, despite the fact that these European countries have many restrictions of their own, meaning their own house building rates are not optimal and could also be increased. One specific practical consequence is that the crisis in lab space in the so-called Oxford-Cambridge arc is driving companies to cities such as Boston in the United States, which have millions of square feet immediately available. Number two, Britain does not just have fewer housing units than comparable countries, but also has unusually small ones. The average British house has only 2/3 of the floor space of the average Dutch, German, Belgian, or French house, and less than half of the floor space of the average North American, Australian, or New Zealand house. Number three, median house prices in England stand at more than 8 times the median annual full-time salary before taxes. In the mid-19th century, the average house price stood at about 12 times average earnings. On the eve of World War II, so about a century later, that ratio had constantly dropped to around 4. But between 1997 and 2022, the HAR, Housing Affordability Ratio, shot up from 3.5 to 8.3 in England and from 3 to 6.2 in Wales. Number 4, social housing accounted for a large proportion of Britain's housing stock. 16.7% of UK housing units were in the social rented sector, which is more than twice the EU average, 7.5%, and the OECD average, 7%. This meant that Britain had to spend an unusually high amount on housing cost support payments, 1.4% of GDP, as opposed to a US average of about 0.16, leading to higher taxes across the board. Number 5. And rental prices? With Brussels as an index of 100, we see about 520 for London, 90 for Vienna, and 180 for Frankfurt. Number 6. The total effect of all these factors makes the country as a whole poorer in multiple ways. It leads to higher consumer prices across the board. It reduces labor mobility and productivity. It undermines work incentives. It comes at a high fiscal cost, and it introduces microeconomic instability. Last but not least, it drives political polarization, especially along generational lines. And it doesn't have to be this way, as it wasn't in much of England's history. Even relatively recently, from the mid-19th century until the outbreak of World War II, the British housing stock used to grow by 1 to 2% per year, and housing affordability used to improve steadily. And so why did the rate of building slow? Niemietz believes 2 basic reasons. A, the adoption of a new, more restrictive planning system in 1947, the Town and Country Planning Act, and B, the subsequent formation of organized resistance to development, NIMBYism. Let's briefly describe these 2 destructive causes. The basic problem with the Town and Country Planning Act was that its main effect was to reverse the default option. It replaced a permissive system in which development is generally allowed unless specifically prohibited with a restrictive one in which development is generally banned unless specifically allowed. Then came greenbelts in the 1950s, these being buffer zones around urban areas where virtually all development is banned as well. A double whammy. Finally, since with all these restrictions you create winners and losers every time you give permission to build a new set of houses, came resistance to new builds called NIMBYism, partly a coalition of local governments and residents. This, according to a study by Bank of England economist Kate Barker, resulted in the housing supply in the UK becoming completely unresponsive to price signals, and that this had led not only to escalating housing costs, but also to all kinds of economic problems. Successive governments have all failed to loosen these restrictions. The result? House building rates since 1980 have been fluctuating between just 0.5 and 1% per annum, an exceptionally low level by international standards. At this point, having given us these brutal facts, he turns to his description of YIMBY, Britain 2035, describing what would happen if, under new YIMBY, yes, in my backyard policies, Britain started building again. And as we gaze with him into the future, much more successful Britain, what do we see? Britain is building like mad. Even though the share of the British-born workforce employed in construction has surged to its highest level since the 1960s, the Home Office's shortage occupation list still reads like a Yellow Pages directory of building-related trades. Bricklayers, carpenters, glazers, roofers, pipe fitters, painters, decorators, tile setters, plasterers, structural engineers. All this rapidly increased stock of housing means, number one, rents are plummeting. Since the flooding of the rental market with new rental properties has put landlords under a degree of competitive pressure they could not previously have imagined. A situation in which too many tenants were chasing too few rental properties has been replaced by a situation in which too many landlords are chasing too few tenants. Number two, this too has been reflected in the social housing market, the government-supplied and subsidized market, with a sharp reduction in demand for social housing and thus a steep drop in waiting times. Number three, with the introduction of much new housing stock has come a natural increase in energy efficiency, as older, less energy-efficient units are phased out. Number four, Niemietz, looking into his crystal ball, also sees a less politically polarized country than the Britain of the 2010s and 2020s. Easing the housing crisis seems to have had the remarkable side effect of reconciling the millennial generation and Generation Z with a market economy. In other words, the battle of younger and older generations, selfish boomers hoarding all the housing wealth versus entitled youngsters who can't afford a house because they spend all their money on frivolous things, has subsided. Number five, and the effect on green spaces and the green belt? Yes, some green spaces have been lost, but there has never been any truth in the idea of Britain as an overdeveloped island, and there still is no truth in it now. Before the housing revolution, less than 10% of England was developed, while the overall amount of undeveloped land has decreased a bit. It has decreased from a very high level. And how did all this revival come about? How was the resistance of the NIMBYs overcome? Niemietz describes it thus. Unlike on previous occasions, this time something else happened. There was an outpouring of public support, expressed, for example, on social media, in polls, and in focus group interviews. The housing secretary's popularity ratings rose and soon surpassed those of every other member of the cabinet, including the prime ministers. Emboldened by this newfound popularity, the housing secretary began to thrive in the role of an anti-NIMBY cultural warrior who, far from seeking compromise or accommodation, openly sought confrontation with NIMBYs, teasing and taunting them at every opportunity. The ensuing controversies energized the hitherto dormant YIMBY bloc even further. And thus, for the first time, YIMBYism became an actual electoral force. YIMBY versus NIMBY became akin to a culture war issue, much like woke versus anti-woke, which meant that sitting on the fence was not an option. The planning gain refers to the vast increase in property values once permission to build, which again is by default denied in Britain, has been granted. The idea of spreading the planning gain more widely and thereby making development more popular was age-old and seemingly obvious. But it was only after the rise of the YIMBYs that Britain started to systematically make use of it. It all continued to go uphill from there, with A, developers paying more of infrastructure costs, B, the mass rollout of community land auctions under which councils buy land from local landowners, grant themselves planning permission, and then auction off that land to developers, capturing a large chunk of the planning gain in the process. C, various forms of direct compensation payments from developers or landowners to local residents who were most affected by proposed development projects. D, a more general rebalancing of the tax system towards the local level. With increased self-reliance of local governments came additional autonomy and flexibility. This made it much easier for local governments to react to the challenges presented by additional housing. E, the selective granting of planning permission on greenbelt land within a walkable radius around commuter stations, extending this permission to all greenbelts, including those around Oxford and Cambridge. F, the government began to roll out street votes, a proposal to densify existing neighborhoods, whereby the residents of an individual street can, in effect, collectively opt out of the planning system. G, a return of the Newtowns policy of the 1950s, but this time as capitalist ventures. They are not the projects of town planning bureaucrats imposing their idea of how other people should live. They are instead the projects of private investors who have skin in the game. They can lose a lot of money if things go wrong. And finally, H, as important as any single development, the replacement of Britain's discretionary planning system with a rules-based one. This means that rather than haggling over each individual planning proposal, planning authorities should spell out in advance what could be built where. Building applications that complied with these pre-specified criteria, the zoning code, would then get near automatic approval. Niemietz concludes this fictional scenario by saying, given that Britain's housing revolution was such an unambiguous success story, it now seems hard to believe that it was initially extremely polarizing and wildly unpopular with millions of people. Today, the continuity NIMBYs, who still have not come to terms with it, look like the equivalent of the Japanese holdout. Those scattered Japanese army units who, in their minds, still kept fighting World War II long after the Japanese Empire had ceased to exist. This, by the way, is one of the many instances of Niemietz's subtle humor that he often displays. I'd give this overall an A-. Happy to see that at last some amongst you in modern England understand the extent to which freedom in all areas, and especially in housing and urban development, will help to make England great. Yet again, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.